just really like this book. Nowhere to Call Home by Cynthia DeFelice. Chapter 1. With a start, Frances Elizabeth Barrow awoke from a sound sleep. She sat straight up in bed, her heart pounding unpleasantly. A noise, a loud one, had awakened her. But what, she wondered groggily, had it been? Some part of her brain recognized the sound, but in her muddled state of half-sleep, she couldn't quite place it. The longer she tried, the more unsure she became about what it had sounded like, or if she had even heard it at all. She rang the bell, and Miss Bailey, the housekeeper, soon peered in the door. In answer to Frances's question, she said, "It was nothing, miss. Go back to sleep." But her voice shook, her face was pale, and her smile looked ghastly in the dim light of the hallway. When Mrs. Bailey's footsteps died away, Frances looked at the clock and saw that it was close to midnight. She got out of bed and peered down the corridor. Lights shone from her father's wing of the house. She wanted to go ask him what the noise was, and why Mrs. Bailey had acted so peculiar, but she didn't. Father didn't like to be disturbed at night. He didn't like Frances disturbing him at any time, for that matter. She shut her eyes and listened hard. At first she heard only the ticking of the grandfather clock on the landing, and the occasional creak of the big old house's woodwork. But then she detected muffled voices coming from the direction of her father's rooms. A knock at the front door made her jump with surprise. She hurried to her bedroom window. A police car and an ambulance were pulled up in front of their house. A police car and an ambulance were pulled up in front of the house, their lights flashing eerily through the drizzle. Running to the top of the stairs, Frances saw Gordon, the butler, in the foyer. Frances had never seen Gordon wearing anything but his proper suit and tie, but there he was in pajamas, dressing gown and slippers, his hair rumpled from sleep. He opened the door to admit 3 men, 2 of them in policeman uniforms. There was a short discussion before the men, accompanied by Gordon, began climbing the stairs. "Gordon, what was that loud noise?" Frances asked. "Where's Father?" "Miss Frances," exclaimed Gordon, usually so composed and dignified, the butler looked startled and ill at ease. You should be in bed, miss." "But what has happened?" Frances asked. "You wait, miss," Gordon said. "In your room. Mary or Miss Bailey, someone will come and—" His words came out disjointed and choppy, then trailed off. He added with a desperate, pleading note in his voice, "Please, miss." Frances was so taken aback by Gordon's odd behavior that she stepped aside at the top of the stairs to let him pass. The 3 men nodded to her grimly as they, too, walked by. They headed down the corridor towards her father's rooms, and Frances stood frozen with uncertainty and dread. She did not want to disobey Gordon, but she couldn't go back to her room and wait. She had to know what was happening now. After a moment of indecision, she began running down the hallway toward the lights and the sounds and stopped at the door to Father's sitting room. There the servants, Miss Bailey, Mary the housemaid, Bridget the cook, even Junius, the stooped old gardener, who had been with the family since Frances's father was a boy, were gathered, along with Gordon. The door to her father's bedroom was ajar. Frances could hear the other 3 men talking in low, urgent voices. Before the servants saw her, she had a moment to observe their faces. They looked frightened, she thought. She began to feel frightened herself. Their talk stopped when they saw her. Frances asked the only question she could think of. "Is Father ill?" Mary gasped and covered her face with her hands. Bridget turned a deep red, and tears squeezed out of the corners of her eyes. "Oh, the poor wee lass," she whispered. Miss Bailey, the housekeeper, stared fixedly at the wall. The others looked down at their feet. At last Gordon cleared his throat and said, "No, miss, that is—" For a moment Frances felt like stamping her foot and shouting. Why were the servants acting as if they'd lost their senses, as well as their power of speech? "Father," she called, "what has happened?" She rushed toward the bedroom door, but after just a few steps she found herself lifted up into Junius's warm embrace. "No, Miss Frankie," he said. "You don't want to go in there." Junius was the only person who called Frances Frankie, and he did so only when Father wasn't around. Father didn't approve of nicknames, saying they were for the lower classes. He said that Frances had been given a perfectly good name when she was born, and that he expected people to use it. But Frances loved being called Frankie. She almost smiled, until she looked into Junius's face and saw the anguish in his eyes. The unease that Frances had been feeling when she first awakened fluttered in her throat. She buried her face in the front of Junius's bathrobe, wishing that she could stay right there, with Junius's arms around her and his hands gently patting her back, and never ever have to listen to whatever it was he was about to tell her. "Frankie, Frankie, Frankie," he murmured soothingly. "Something bad has happened, Frankie, and I need you to be strong and brave as you can be." "Can you do that for old Junius?" Frances shivered. Without looking up, she nodded. "You come on with me now," he said softly. Frances walked with Junius down the hallway to her bedroom. They sat together on the Davenport, and Junius gazed into Frances's eyes. His own eyes held kindness and pain. He seemed to be having trouble deciding how to begin. At last he said, "Miss Frankie, do you recall about this time last year, folks were mighty upset about something called the stock market?" Frances nodded. She had heard her father speak of the stock market, though she had no clear idea what it was, and she remembered everyone talking about how it had crashed. She remembered, too, how tense and ill-tempered Father had been during those days. But what did that have to do with what was happening now, tonight, in her house? Black Thursday, they called that day, you remember? You remember, Frankie? Then came Black Tuesday right after. It was in all the newspapers and on the radio. Lots of folks had pieces of paper they thought were worth a lot of money. Then boom, those pieces of paper weren't worth anything at all. Again, Frances nodded. The newspapers had been full of stories of grown men who had jumped out of windows on hearing that their fortunes were gone. "Well," said Junius, "that stock market crash helped to bring about what we got now. That's called a depression. That means it's real hard times for lots of folks." Frances listened, waiting for Junius to start making sense and tell her what was going on in Father's room. As Junius talked, she was dimly aware of voices in the hallway and footsteps on the stairs. Now your father was some... Blah. What a sentence. "Now, your father was some smart kind of businessman, you know that," Junius went on. "He kept his factories going when businesses everywhere were closing their doors. But hard times caught up with him, too. He got some real bad news yesterday, Frankie. His business is bankrupt. He lost his money. It's all gone." Frances shook her head. She couldn't imagine Father losing his money. Father was never careless about money. He was always telling Frances how important it was for her to appreciate the value of $1. He went to his offices each day to watch over his money. Every night he spent hours poring over papers covered with figures. Frances's father knew everything about money, and how to make it, and how to keep it. Poor Father, he must be very sad, so sad that he had taken to his bed. "Your father was a proud man, Frankie," Junius went on. "Proud of all that money he made. And when he lost it, well, I guess he just couldn't see his way to... Damn, Junius. And when he lost it, well, I guess he just couldn't see his way to doing without it. Tonight, well..." "Father," Frances blurted, wanting only to stop Junius from saying what he was going to say next. Hearing it spoken out loud would make it true, and then nothing would ever be the same again. "I want to see him." "No, Miss Frankie, you don't want to do that," answered Junius, shaking his head. "A 12-year-old child shouldn't see a thing like that, no, sir. You remember your daddy like he was." Then Frances's mind grasped the full meaning of the old gardener's words. She heard that sound again, that had awakened her, and recognized it for what it had been. A gunshot. Her father was dead. He had taken his own life. Francis was an orphan and penniless.